Julia and I were stoked for this hike. We'd tackled tough trails before, but this section of the Appalachian Trail was supposed to be a real test. Wild, remote, and practically untouched. As we stocked up on supplies at a little general store near the trailhead, the cashier, an old man with a sunken face, gave us a strange look. "Y'all be careful out there," he muttered. "People go missin' on that stretch. Trails ain't what they seem." I chuckled, brushing it off as local folklore. "You hear that, Jules? Spooky stories to scare the tourists." Julia smiled, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Maybe we should stick to the main path," she suggested. "Nah, we've got this," I reassured her. But as we started hiking, the woods felt different. Oppressively quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the ground. Julia glanced around, her unease growing. I forced a grin, trying to shake the creeping feeling that something wasn't right. After all, it was just a hike, right? We'd been hiking for hours, the sun barely piercing through the thickening canopy above. The trail markers that had guided us so clearly at the start were now almost impossible to find, and every time we did spot one, it seemed to be further off the path than it should have been. The deeper we went, the more the silence gnawed at us. It wasn't just quiet. It was unnatural, like the forest itself was waiting for something. I cracked a few jokes to lighten the mood, but even I could hear the strain in my voice. Julia wasn't laughing. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her unease now fully evident. "I think we should head back," she finally said, her voice tight. "Yeah, maybe you're right," I agreed, trying to sound casual. We turned around, but the path behind us was gone, swallowed by the forest. Where there should have been a clear trail, there was now only dense underbrush and twisted trees that seemed to close in on us. Panic started to rise as I heard it. A faint whisper, my name, carried on the breeze. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Julia grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. We were lost, and we weren't alone. Our calm evaporated, replaced by sheer panic as we desperately tried to retrace our steps. Every direction we turned seemed wrong, the trees shifting and closing in like they were alive. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, each breath coming faster than the last. The whispers had grown louder, no longer just a faint suggestion but a constant, insistent murmur that seemed to wrap around us from every angle. "Sonny, do you hear that?" Julia's voice was barely a whisper herself, her eyes wide with terror. "I hear it," I said, though I wished I didn't. The sound was maddening. My name repeated over and over, just beyond my reach. I pulled out our compass, but the needle was spinning wildly, as if mocking me. The GPS wasn't any better, the screen flashing random coordinates that made no sense. I tried to focus, to think logically, but the forest seemed to warp around us, trees twisting and paths vanishing before our eyes. Julia grabbed my arm, her grip tight and trembling. "We're not alone out here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the relentless whispers. "Something's playing with us, Sonny. It doesn't want us to leave." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was just scared, but deep down I felt it too. There was something malevolent in these woods, something that had been waiting for us to wander too far. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, but the more I thought, the more everything blurred together. The trail we'd followed so confidently was now a maze of unfamiliar trees and impossible turns. I was losing my grip on reality, the whispers in my head louder now, almost drowning out my own thoughts. Julia's breathing was rapid, verging on hyperventilation. "We need to move," she said, her voice cracking. "We need to get out of here, Sonny." But I had no idea how. Every direction felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where we went, something was leading us deeper into the forest's grasp. We stumbled into the clearing, our legs heavy with exhaustion, and gasped at what we saw. The space was small, encircled by ancient stones covered in thick, dark moss. They stood like silent sentinels, marking a place that felt untouched by time. But it was what lay in the center that made my blood run cold: Julia's backpack. It sat there as if waiting for us, though she swore she'd never dropped it. How did it get here?" Julia's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to grab it, but then everything happened at once. The whispers, now a cacophony, surrounded us from all sides, deafening and suffocating. Julia's hand froze inches from her pack, and then, in an instant, she was gone, vanished without a sound, as if she'd been swallowed by the air itself. "Julia!" I screamed, spinning around, searching the clearing, but there was nothing, just the ancient stones and the darkness that seemed to press in from every direction. I was alone, paralyzed with fear, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could feel it then, an ominous presence behind me, cold and all-consuming. Slowly, I turned, my breath catching in my throat, and was met with pure, endless darkness. My scream echoed through the forest, cutting through the night, then nothing. Just silence, as if the forest had devoured me whole. The morning I set out on my trek, the Andes stretched out before me like an untamed wilderness, vast and inviting. I'd heard the stories everyone had. The villagers at the base of the mountain warned me about the curse, spinning tales of travelers who climbed too high and never returned. I couldn't help but smile at their superstitions. I wasn't here for ghost stories. I was here to document history, to be the first to capture the ruins of the ancient temple on film. The initial climb was breathtaking, the mountains rising like giants around me, their snow-capped peaks piercing the sky. But as I ascended, the air began to shift. A cold breeze swept through the valleys, and with it came a thick fog that slowly rolled in, swallowing the path ahead. It wasn't long before the vibrant landscape was replaced by an eerie, gray mist that clung to everything, obscuring my surroundings. Despite the creeping chill, I pushed on, telling myself that the fog was just another challenge to overcome. Yet, with every step, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the mountain itself was watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. But I was determined. I'd come too far to turn back now. The higher I climbed, the more the mountains seemed to turn against me. The temperature plummeted, each breath coming out in clouds of frost. My fingers grew numb even through my gloves, and the fog thickened to the point where I could barely see a few feet in front of me. It felt like I was walking through a living, breathing entity, its tendrils of mist curling around me, guiding me deeper into its grasp. That's when I first noticed the symbols, carved into the rocks lining the trail. They were crude, ancient-looking, etched deep into the stone, their meanings lost to time. I ran my fingers over one of them, trying to decipher its purpose, but it only filled me with unease. These weren't markings left by casual travelers. They felt like warnings, placed by those who understood the mountain's true nature. As night fell, I set up camp, the fog still clinging to the ground like a shroud. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant, rhythmic sound of drums echoing through the mountains. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder, more insistent. Flickering lights appeared in the fog, like torches moving through the mist. My pulse quickened, a deep sense of unease settling over me that I couldn't shake. Something was out there, just beyond my sight, waiting. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the mountain became, as if it were alive, aware of my presence, and determined to test my resolve. The fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, thickening around me, cutting off the world beyond. The sensation of being watched had grown unbearable, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end with every step. I'd catch glimpses of shadowy figures in the periphery of my vision, shifting forms that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. My gear, once reliable, began to fail me. My compass spun uselessly, the needle whirling in circles as if it, too, had lost its way. The GPS, which had been my lifeline, blinked out, showing nothing but static and garbled coordinates. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down. I couldn't afford to lose my nerve. Not now, not this close. But the mountains seemed intent on breaking me. The drumming I'd heard the night before had grown louder, more insistent, a relentless beat that pounded through the fog and into my skull. The lights, those strange, flickering torches, moved with purpose now, guiding me or perhaps forcing me towards the summit. With every step, the dread intensified, a growing certainty that the mountain itself was alive, that it was aware of me, and that it wanted me to reach its peak. But not for any reason I could understand. No, this was something darker, something malevolent. Exhaustion weighed on me, but I couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. The path behind me seemed to disappear into the mist, leaving me with only one option: forward, up, into whatever awaited me at the top. At last, I reached the temple, though it was nothing like I'd imagined. What had once been a majestic structure was now a graveyard of crumbling stone and broken pillars, swallowed by the mountain's wrath. The fog parted just enough to reveal the temple's outline, a ghost of its former self, looming ominously ahead. I stepped inside, my boots crunching over ancient debris, the air thick with the scent of decay. In the center of the main chamber stood an altar, weathered by time but unmistakable in its purpose. The stone was slick with dried blood, the stains blackened and cracked, as if the mountain itself had tried to absorb the sacrifices made here. A shiver ran down my spine, but I couldn't stop. I had to document this, to prove I was here. The moment I crossed the threshold, the heavy stone doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing me in darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as the drumming surged, no longer distant but right there with me, reverberating off the walls, growing louder and faster. I fumbled with my camera, its dim light barely piercing the blackness. As I raised it to my face, I realized the truth. I was trapped. The last image I captured was my own reflection, eyes wide with terror, before the camera blinked out, the darkness swallowing me whole. The drumming continued, relentless, until there was nothing left but silence. The mountain had claimed another soul.
The sun was shining, and the sky was a brilliant blue as we set out on our hike through Samaria Gorge. It felt like the perfect day for an adventure. Clear skies, a light breeze, and everyone in high spirits. We joked and laughed, snapping photos of the breathtaking views as we descended deeper into the gorge. The sheer cliffs towering above us were awe-inspiring, casting long shadows that danced along the rocky path. But as we continued, I started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a chill in the air that didn't match the warmth of the sun, like a cold breeze trailing behind us. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling nagged at me. Then I saw it. A shadow moving along the cliffside out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the jagged rock face. I laughed it off, telling myself I was just nervous. But as we kept going, that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. The gorge was beautiful, yes, but there was something beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to shake it off and keep up with my friends, but the sense that we weren't entirely alone stayed with me, just out of reach. As we moved deeper into the gorge, the vibrant energy from earlier faded, replaced by a heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to settle over us. The sheer cliffs, which had felt majestic before, now loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long and dark across our path. The air itself seemed thicker, more suffocating, and every step felt like it was drawing us further away from safety. It started with Sarah. She was the first to fall silent, her eyes locked on a distant cliff. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We all turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just jagged rocks and the empty sky. "There was someone standing there," she insisted, her face pale. We tried to brush it off, but then Mark froze mid-step. His head tilted as if he was listening to something just out of reach. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice hushed. I strained my ears, catching only the sound of the wind, but Mark's face twisted in confusion and fear. "It's like whispering, but I can't understand the words," he murmured, his eyes darting around as if searching for the source. Dan was next, his pace slowing until he came to a stop, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. "There's something behind us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The rest of us turned, but all we saw was the empty path we just walked. Still, the way he kept looking back, his face etched with dread, made my skin crawl. The lively chatter that had filled our hike earlier was gone, replaced by a tense silence. No one laughed, no one joked. We were all too focused on the strange, unsettling sensations that seemed to be closing in around us. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step, and every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig sent our hearts racing. My unease had now transformed into a gnawing fear that I couldn't shake. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and it was becoming harder to deny. The gorge, once a place of beauty, now felt like a trap, its high walls boxing us in, keeping us away from whatever it was that stalked us from the shadows. We were no longer alone, and the realization sent chills down my spine. We quickened our pace, the fear of whatever was stalking us driving us forward. The eerie silence that had settled over us earlier was shattered by something far more terrifying: the sound of laughter. It started faint, just a distant echo bouncing off the walls of the gorge, but with each step, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the joyful sound of friends sharing a joke. It was cold, mocking, as if the very gorge was taunting us. "Do you hear that?" Sarah's voice was shaky, her eyes wide with terror. We all nodded, unable to deny it now. The laughter was everywhere, surrounding us, bouncing off the cliffs and filling the air. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, each cruel chuckle seeming to tighten the invisible noose around us. "Where's the exit?" Dan's voice was high-pitched, his usual calm demeanor shattered. "We should have been out by now." "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Mark suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. He was scanning the darkening walls, his face pale. "We just need to find the right path." "There is no right path, Mark," Sarah snapped, her panic rising. "We're lost, and something is out there, playing with us." I could feel the tension between us building, the fear pushing us to the brink. Every shadow that moved sent a wave of dread through the group, and the path seemed to be getting narrower, the walls of the gorge pressing in on us, as if the landscape itself was conspiring to trap us. "We need to calm down," I tried to say, but my voice sounded as strained as the rest of them. The laughter hadn't stopped. It was louder now, echoing through the gorge, mingling with the sound of our own labored breathing. The shadows, once just flickers in the corner of our vision, were becoming darker, more solid, almost as if they were closing in on us. Dan spun around, his eyes wild. "This isn't real. None of this is real." But there was no conviction in his words, just desperation. "It's real enough," Mark muttered, glancing at the narrowing path ahead. "We need to move now." The panic was contagious, spreading through us like wildfire. We started to run, not caring about the treacherous ground beneath our feet, just desperate to escape. But the faster we ran, the more it felt like the gorge was closing in, the laughter chasing us, nipping at our heels, driving us toward madness. The walls loomed higher, the sky disappearing into a narrow strip of gray far above, and I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down, squeezing the air from my lungs. We were no longer in control. The gorge was, and it was playing with us, leading us deeper into its grasp. We reached the iron gates, the narrowest, most claustrophobic part of the gorge, where the cliffs loomed so close that they seemed to touch the sky. The path had dwindled to a tight squeeze between the towering walls, the shadows deepening into a suffocating darkness. That's when the laughter returned, louder and more menacing than ever, reverberating off the stone and enveloping us in its cruel echo. The ground began to tremble beneath our feet, the vibrations rising through our bodies as rocks started to rain down from above. "Run!" someone shouted, but the voice was lost in the cacophony of falling stone and mocking laughter. We bolted, panic driving us into a desperate sprint down the treacherous path. I was running on pure adrenaline, the world around me a blur of jagged rocks and shifting shadows. The path was narrow, uneven, and treacherous. My foot caught on a loose stone, and I went down hard, my hands scraping against the rough ground. I tried to push myself up, but pain shot through my ankle, leaving me gasping for breath. "Emily!" I heard my friends shouting, but they were already pulling ahead, their figures shrinking in the distance as they continued to flee. When I looked up, the world seemed to tilt. Standing over me was a ghostly figure, a woman draped in pale, tattered clothes. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb all light. She stared down at me with a look of pure malice, as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound caught in my throat as the walls of the gorge seemed to close in, the air growing thick and heavy. The rocks above creaked ominously, the tremors growing stronger, and the cliffs began to move, as if the gorge itself was coming alive. I tried to crawl backward, to escape the woman's cold, piercing gaze, but the ground beneath me shifted, pulling me closer to her. The last thing I saw was her face, a twisted smile forming on her lips, before the darkness swallowed me whole. My scream echoed through the gorge, a final desperate plea that was quickly drowned out by the sound of the mountain closing in around me. In the distance, I could hear my friend's frantic footsteps fading away, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. The gorge claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before.